It's an honor to have Michael Marsicano here with us. We've been friends since he was an undergraduate. Some of you all will know of, if you don't know, Mary Siemens, the marvelous woman who was so important in the life of Duke University in many ways. She's the one who brought us together, her interest in the arts, and I think her interest in the arts had something to do with Michael's first steps in the arts here. He, as you know, was the head of the Arts Council in Durham, and from which he left after a while to go to Charlotte. Michael's, I discovered today, I didn't realize this, and anybody who knows anything about this can correct me if you'd like. Michael is a triple Duke undergraduate, master's, and PhD. His PhD is from Duke when it had an school of education, which it doesn't anymore. But his degree says that he is a PhD in education and a minor in public policy. I don't know of anybody else who has getting a PhD with a minor in public policy. I didn't even know the category existed. but in any event, that's one of the singular things about Michael Marsicano. The other singular things are really related to what he's done. When Michael took over the leadership of the Foundation for the Carolinas, which is, as we discussed earlier, is probably misnamed because it really is not the foundation for all of North and South Carolina. It really is the foundation for metropolitan Charlotte. That's its catchment area. That's where most of its endowments come from, and where most of its programs focus on. But what's really astonishing that I learned this afternoon, when Michael took over the role of president of the Foundation for the Carolinas, it had assets of $200 million. Today, after his leadership, for how many years? 20 years, the endowment of the Foundation for the Carolinas is $2.6 billion, making it the 6th largest community foundation in the United States. Which is just a great, says something about his capacity to build assets and to manage them well. And if you look at anybody who knows anything about community foundations knows that the Foundation for the Carolinas is just one of the most dynamic, interesting community foundations in the country in terms of the leadership that is involving in the community, getting the community involved in it, reaching out, figuring out ways to involve communities that are adjacent to Charlotte, as well as what it does in Charlotte. And so that's an extraordinary achievement. But even more extraordinary, the world of community foundations has, as like every other kind of world, has good community foundations and not so good community foundations. And among the good foundations, the ones whom you would like to model the world of community foundations around, the Foundation for the Carolinas is one of those, and one of those leading organizations. So it's really an honor to have Michael here, longtime friend, leader in a major field of philanthropy, and I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting talk. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Joel.
You can
Thank
now
you.
stand up.
Joel is very generous, and I'm grateful for this invitation, and it's so great to see old friends and to meet some new friends. I delight in returning to the campus. I have two love affairs in my life. The greater of the two is my wife, Leslie. The second is with Duke, and they are inextricably linked. Leslie and her family hold 12 degrees from Duke. So I earned 3 just to get attention. We married in graduate school here at Duke, and our first home was in a dormitory on East Campus, where I served as the first male house counselor for 120 women. Our first son, who graduated from the master's program here years later, was born at Duke Hospital. And never could I have imagined that one day I would serve on both the board of the trustees here at Duke and the board of the health system. It is an understatement to say that my Duke experience was transformational and continues to be so, and certainly my friendship with Joel Fleishman has been a highlight of that transformation. Today, I want to share with you thoughts on philanthropy, and I'm going to divide our time together into 3 sections. The final section is going to be a case study format that is going to be interactive, and that will beg the question, is philanthropy a form of free speech? First, I'm going to focus on positioning of philanthropy in American society in ways that you might not have thought. Then I'll speak to the fall and rise of philanthropic intermediaries, which are in rapid transition. And finally, I'll present 2 case interactive studies highlighting the grant-making challenges of community-based intermediaries. So let's begin with my thoughts on positioning philanthropy in American society. When we survey the national landscape, we find that Americans are deeply troubled that the civic life in the country they love is seriously compromised by the performance of government at all levels. I'm telling you nothing new there. And yet, I believe by enabling a rich tradition of philanthropy, our government may have handed to us keys to a future that we can look with pride. Every day, we as Americans support nonprofit causes we care about, from gifts to universities, museums, food banks, homeless shelters, environmental agencies, and charity is a part of who we are as a people. Most of us, however, don't understand the gravity of federal and state policies that have built such generosity into our DNA. In the United States, we believe government exists to serve the people, to advance society, and to enable the prosperity of the governed. Accordingly, when we individuals or corporations seek to advance human welfare as philanthropists, our government responds in a most curious and extraordinary way. Our government takes money from us in the form of taxation and uses it to advance the welfare of our people. But when we, as individuals, volunteer our hard-earned dollars to advance society by freely giving from our own pockets, we pay less to Uncle Sam. We get the tax deduction. Wow. Let me say that again. Wow. As a matter of public policy, the law of this land rewards us for taking a personal role in helping others. Uncle Sam gets less when we give him more. You can even use your tax deduction to contradict your government. If you believe Uncle Sam is wrong, he will still give you a tax deduction when you finance the opposition. If you donate to a nonprofit. For instance, Uncle Sam might believe in correctional facilities. You may want to abolish prisons. Find a nonprofit with that purpose, and you still get the tax deduction. And I'm going to say again, wow. Nowhere else in the world do we find such trust of the governed by the government. But the story doesn't end there. The tax deduction is only possible when a gift is made to a nonprofit organization led by like-minded zealots. We call these like-minded zealots board of directors. Here before you is the Duke Board of Trustees. These volunteer board members collectively decide in a mini representative democracy how to spend all the tax-deducted contributions of all the people who made gifts to that nonprofit. In other words, our government gave board members control over much more than their own personal tax deduction, namely the tax deduction of many. And last year, Duke University raised $507 million in tax-deductible contributions. Today, nonprofits in America number just more than 1.8 million, roughly. If each nonprofit board has, on average, 15 members, then approximately 24 million of us serve as an extended form of representative democracy, empowered to spend what otherwise would have been Uncle Sam's. Now, why do we do this? I believe we are a people who value systems of checks and balances. Just look at our 3 branches of government, which were purposely designed to ensure checks and balances. And so too, in my view, is the very nature of the charitable tax deduction. Throughout the last 100 years, solutions to many of our challenges have been born outside of government, born outside of the corporate sector and financed by philanthropy. In her book, Claire Gaudiani maintains that most people think Americans are generous because we are rich. She turns this notion completely upside down. She says the truth is we are rich in significant part because we are generous. And her book is full of examples where philanthropy-sponsored research has moved our society forward. And I would argue that the very foundation on which the private American university was built is the tax deduction. So what are the results of an American society that grants its people tax deductions when they care about others? In the most recent documented year of 2017, American philanthropy totaled $410 billion, larger than the GDPs of Chile, South Africa, or Denmark, just to name a few. And over time, these annual tax-deductible contributions have fueled a nonprofit industry of great size and growing influence. I said there are 1.8 million roughly nonprofits, and the industry is now 10% of the domestic workforce, employing more than 12 million Americans and accounting for 5% of GDP. And looking ahead, a new tidal wave of philanthropic dollars is just beginning that will grow exponentially if tax laws continue to encourage it. In their book, Goldsecker and Moody state that a new generation of donors are expected to inherit up to $59 trillion in the next few decades. And thanks to our growing social activists and philanthropic cultures, the authors estimate that future philanthropists will allocate almost half of that sum to charitable causes. Traditionally, it's been 20%. The projections are now 50%. And they refer to that potential of 27 trillion to a new golden age of giving. At Foundation for the Carolinas, our future pipeline of estate gifts, which are not on our books, stands today at $850 million. These dollars will eventually flow through to nonprofits and causes as designated by our donors or left to us in an unrestricted way. So we are looking at a future in which nonprofits play an even greater role in society. And some have even asked a provocative question whether philanthropy might be the saving grace of democracy. Perhaps this has encouraged you to think a little differently about our rich tradition of philanthropy. I intentionally wrapped charitable giving in the American flag, where I believe it belongs. And now I'd like to turn our attention to intermediaries. Americans pursue their philanthropic activities in a variety of ways, through a variety of vehicles. A philanthropic intermediary receives tax-deductible contributions and functions as a way station, if you will, before donations ultimately find their way to specific mission-driven charities. There are at least two collective giving intermediaries here in Durham: your United Way and your Arts Council campaigns. Citizens make gifts to one or both in solidarity with hundreds, perhaps thousands of their neighbors. And these donors have empowered a board of directors to make decisions about which nonprofits are most deserving of those collective gifts. The United Way is an example of a rapid decline in this type of philanthropic intermediary. Across America in 2017, 180 plus United Ways collected $3.26 billion in contributions, and that's nothing to ignore. However, the number has declined since 2007 by 28%, adjusted for inflation.
Amazing.
In Charlotte alone, giving to our United Way declined from its peak in $45 million in 2008 to $27 million in 2019, as one example. Many American corporations have redesigned their workplace giving campaigns, if they still exist them at all. A new generation of donors believes such intermediaries have lost their value proposition. For example, donors once dependent on a United Way to vet for the highest performing nonprofits in a community now can do so online in a variety of ways. Dozens of giving apps now enable nonprofits to more easily appeal to donors directly. And this younger generation has no interest in donating to a third party that decides where their contributions should go. All of this combined with the well-documented lack of trust in all types of institutions in America today, we shouldn't be surprised that collective giving is on the decline. In contrast, another form of philanthropic intermediary is dramatically on the rise. These intermediaries are foundations, both private family foundations and public community foundations. The former type you know well, the Gates, the Ford, the Rockefeller foundations, and of course Mr. Duke's foundation, domiciled in Charlotte and named the Duke Endowment. When a wealthy family places charitable assets in a private foundation, it has created a philanthropic intermediary. This form of philanthropic way station is legally required to grant, as many of you know, 5% of its assets annually to specific charities. Private foundations are growing dramatically. In 2015, 80,000 American private foundations held $792 billion in assets. And just 2 years later, more than 2,500 new private foundations adding $67 billion in assets were added. And we expect this trend to continue with this pending wealth transfer. And when we look at American philanthropy, we see that a decade ago, 41 billion, or 13% of total estimated giving, came from foundations. By 2018, that amount had grown to 76 billion, or 18% of the giving pie to nonprofits. This graph shows us contributions flowing into foundation intermediaries before going out to nonprofits. These numbers grew as well, rising from 33 billion in 2008 to 50 billion in 2018. Now, a less known intermediary in the foundation space is the public community foundation, a sister to the private family foundation. Here in Durham, you are served by the Triangle Community Foundation, and I lead the Charlotte-based and misnamed Foundation for the Carolinas. Community foundations are multifaceted, full-service centers for philanthropy. They hold charitable funds of all shapes and sizes that are established by many different entities: family funds, nonprofit endowments, scholarships, corporate funds, disaster relief funds, the list goes on. Many, if not most, are donor-directed, meaning the donor chooses where to place the grants from the fund in their name. Over time, many community foundations have garnered assets with high percentages of unrestricted dollars, meaning dollars the foundation can grant to nonprofits in their own discretion. Typically, community foundations leverage community change with these unrestricted assets through grant making and what I call civic leadership activities. Now, when a donor makes a gift to their intermediary donor advised fund, they receive a higher tax deduction than by going with a private foundation. The donor pays no excise tax on investment earnings and is not even required to pay out 5% a year like private foundations. And most of those funds award a higher percentage of the assets each year. While giving to intermediaries like United Way declined dramatically, 28% from 2000 to 2017, donor advised funds have mushroomed, a growth of 340%. And in just 1 year, the number of donor advised funds in America increased by 60%. Meanwhile, the assets of the top 10 American community foundations, which hold donor advised funds, along with other types of giving vehicles, more than doubled in the last decade. In Charlotte, our assets doubled in 5 short years from 1 billion to 2 billion, and just soon after that, we hit 2.6 billion. In one of those 5 years, we received more gifts than you received at Duke University.
Wow.
$628 million to the foundation, compared to $437 million to Duke that year. Now, I rarely celebrate a Duke loss, but I did in 2015. This past year, our 3,000 funds distributed 20,000 grants, totaling $315 million, or 13% of our assets, as opposed to 5% typically at a private foundation. Unlike most private foundations, community foundations are more than grant makers. We have three main purposes: to grow philanthropic capital, serve our fund holders as clients, and to pursue civic leadership activities. And at our foundation, we bring all this together in our flagship program called the Robinson Center for Civic Leadership, named after Sally and Russell Robinson, two proud Duke grads. This is our headquarter building. Because we have no subject matter mission beyond serving our region, we are considered a neutral and trusted convener. This enables us to conduct civic leadership activities that move our communities forward. Such activities begin without a point of view or a preconceived outcome. They engage citizens with data and dialogue. Implementation strategies are developed. Resources are leveraged for execution, and then we launch. And in the past few years, we've placed $18 million in our discretionary dollars toward major civic leadership activities. And we have raised $900 million in matching dollars toward those initiatives from private foundations, corporations, philanthropists, and local government joining us in solidarity. I'll give you three quick examples. We spearheaded this cultural campus of 3 museums and a theater on Main Street by investing $1 million in the initiative and only $100,000 in the planning of it. The effort attracted $232 million in private and public dollars to make it come to life. It's our own little Lincoln Center in Charlotte. Troubled by our high school graduation rates at the highest concentration of poverty high school and the lowest graduation rates in our community, we created Project Lift and invested $2.5 million over 5 years, raising $55 million in private funds to match us and move the graduation rate from 51% to 88%.
Wow.
Recognizing our 24,000 deficit in affordable housing units, we just this past year invested $5 million, which leveraged an additional $270 million in public dollars and philanthropic gifts, land donations, and earth-shattering reduced lending in ways that banks have never tried before, that now a bank like Bank of America is thinking about taking nationwide.
Wow.
Ironically, it is the same community ownership of these intermediaries that also empowers citizens to attack the hands that assist them. In our third and final section, I'm going to present 2 case studies, highlighting the grant-making challenges of a community-based intermediary in civically polarized circumstances. Both are laced with ethical dilemmas, the first featuring a challenge from the right of the political spectrum, and the second featuring a challenge from the left. It is almost counterintuitive to think that goodwill institutions face ethical dilemmas, and certainly not right versus wrong, yet I faced more right versus wrong dilemmas than I could have imagined. But my greatest challenges have resided in the ethics of right versus right. Here is how we're going to proceed, and you're all going to be involved with our first case study. I'm going to give you the background. I'm going to walk you right up to the first of 3 decision points, all with ethical dilemmas. I'm going to place you in my role, and I'm going to ask you to make the decision through your lens. And then I'm going to tell you what decision I made. Before you respond, you can ask me any question. You can ask for additional information. But after you weigh in and tell me what you would have done, I'll reveal the decision I made, and then we'll move on to the next piece of information. The first case study is actually pretty old. It's more than 20 years old, but it could happen today. The challenges I faced then were at the intersection of the conservative religious right, the LGBTQ community, freedom of speech, and government intervention. The second case study is happening now, but just to show some things haven't changed, it also deals with challenges to philanthropy and free speech. And the one that I'm dealing with now is not resolved. The first one, I was the president of a collective giving intermediary, which was the Arts Council in Charlotte. The council was an umbrella, and is, for all arts and culture, and it was funded from 3 sources. Philanthropy, the city, and the county, just like your Durham Arts Council. In Charlotte, with these combined financial resources, the council made up between 25 to 40% of each annual budget of all our major cultural institutions. By way of saying, if anything happened to it, it jeopardized everybody. So let's begin. A professional theater company, which received funding from the Arts Council, presented a brilliant Pulitzer Prize-winning play by Tony Kushner named Angels in America. The content of the play, which dealt with AIDS, homosexuality, love, death, and religion, came under attack by an ultra-conservative group of citizens. In an effort to prevent the play from opening at the Performing Arts Center, the group of citizens found a clause in North Carolina law which at the time made it illegal to disrobe on stage. Angels in America has a 30-second piece of nudity in a health clinic situation when an AIDS patient fully undresses for a physician to examine his lesions. While the religiously conservative group took issue with the nudity was only a means to attack the play because there was no legal ground to challenge it for its homosexual themes, which were their main objections. The conservative group made a formal complaint to the district attorney's office, which threatened to close the Performing Arts Center because of the North Carolina law at the time, if the director of the Performing Arts Center didn't stop the play or modify its content so there would be no nudity. Keeping with me? The director of the Performing Arts Center, not wanting to go to jail, informed the leader of the theater company she would not allow the nude scene. The theater company, refusing to robe the AIDS patient, then sued the Performing Arts Center on free speech grounds. A judge, concerned the state nudity law might be unconstitutional on the basis of free expression, set the law aside for the run of the play. As you can imagine, the play sold more tickets than the theater company had ever sold in the past. Unable to stop the play legally, the ultra-conservative group had nowhere else to direct its anger than to attack the organization that funded the theater company, namely the Arts Council, which I directed at the time. Their goal was to convince private donors to the collective giving campaign and our Mecklenburg County government to eliminate donations and public funding to the Arts Council. At first, donors started canceling their pledges to the Arts Council. I was scared to death. But this turned out to be limited. The greater threat, however, could be the loss of the $2.5 million from the county, which, if lost, would devastate the groups. Unfortunately, a thin majority, 5 of 9 county commissioners, and members from both Republican and Democratic parties supported this petition to eliminate all county funding. As the political process unfolded, our community erupted with protests and counter-protests. It was a subject of choice for all local media outlets, and ultimately the experience would attract worldwide attention, as you'll see in a video in a few minutes. On the eve of the final vote by our elected officials, one county commissioner, claiming to be a swing vote on the issue, sent me a piece of stationery. He had designed it himself with my name on its letterhead. Below the letterhead, he had written a letter for me and asked me to sign it as my own, promising that with my signature he would vote to preserve the money. The letter was laced with thinly veiled statements of censorship, discrimination, and intolerance, essentially suggesting that the Arts Council would shift its funding decisions in these conservative directions. If I didn't sign, the majority would vote to cut the funding. Not only would cultural programs be eliminated, people would lose their jobs. On the other hand, if I did sign the letter, the money would be saved. At the same time, the letter would have had ASC yield to government censorship, and tolerance of differences would have taken a very public blow. This, of course, was the intention of the commissioner who wrote the letter for me to sign. So here's the question. Would you sign the letter composed by the elected official, thereby retaining the $2.5 million in public funding and satisfy some of your private donors? Or would you refuse to sign it? So place yourself in my position at the time. Did I sign? Did I refuse to sign? Before you tell me what you would do, you can ask me any questions so far. Sir?
So clarifying question, you trust the elected official?
Excuse me?
You trust him?
No. Marie?
Was there a credible plan B for raising alternate funding?
Not at this time. Not when I made this decision. But you're foreshadowing.
What was your network in terms of potential national funders or being part of like a larger like association?
So this was happening the same time the National Endowment for the Arts was being attacked. So this was the time in American history called the Cultural War. Well, we're still in Cultural War time, but particularly cultural meaning arts cultural wars. The Mapplethorpe photograph had almost taken the NEA down, so everybody across the country was watching this. But no, none of the funders were national. It's all local money.
So if you signed the letter, you get 2.5 million in funding, but when you projected forward the consequences of signing, how would you evaluate those consequences?
The consequences, I think, would have, well, I'm going to start to give away things if I answer that question. Well, let's put it this way. An arts group that should stand up for freedom of expression would have been the anathema in the cultural community.
So, I mean, it would seem just on the face of it, the downside, the ethical issues aside, just looking at it, the downside would be enormous if you signed it.
Some people believe that. Other people believe that saving people's jobs and not having arts groups close and, you know. So it depended on where you sat
And whose jobs we're talking about.
and whose jobs you're talking about.
I guess this, just to build on that, what was the countervailing pressure from the arts community? Were you given equivalent ultimatums? Or
Yes and no.
you don't know yet?
Yes and no. And it depended on the spectrum of arts groups. So it's an arts and science council. So the Science Museum was sign the letter. Actually, nobody actually knew about the letter, right? This was, no one ever knew about it. You're hearing things that very few people have ever heard. 20 years later, I said, what the hell? No one really knew about the letter. But the Science Museum said, do anything it takes to preserve the funding. The theater group, on the other hand, is in a very different place. And so there was a spectrum of views from the cultural community.
How much public support do you think you had?
I didn't know. The protests were on both sides. An evangelical community erupted that I didn't even know really existed. I had donors who were, not many, but not giving money. I really didn't know that at the time. And I love the questions and the interaction. I also want to make sure you don't get out of here at 7 or 8 o'clock because we got it. So what did I do? Those of you that think that I signed the letter, raise your hand. Well, I don't want to disappoint you. I did not sign the letter. Okay. I called the county commissioner to tell him I could not in good conscience sign the letter. Then I hung up the phone, literally placed my head on the desk and burst into tears, partly from the stress. While the months of pressure leading up to my decision did place me in a strange mental state, I actually wept more for the carnage that I knew was about to come with all my arts organizations. Despite the pending fallout, for me, this was a clear ethical dilemma of right versus wrong. But that didn't make it easier. My internal compass said it was wrong to sign the letter and not right to save the money for having signed the letter. I couldn't put a price tag on intolerance and prejudice, nor could I buy into limitations on freedom of expression, the latter, in my view, a constitutional right. Well, as politics often go, the plot thickens, and the vote was delayed. A second proposal came forward from members of the county commission who were threatening to eliminate ASC's funding. By this time, constituents on both sides of the issue were pressuring the commissioners, who were looking for some form of compromise. Now, background information is required here before I reveal the next question. Many of our cultural institutions house hugely popular programs for children, and they're large in service. For example, our Science Museum, with its large annual budget, is devoted to serving young people, hundreds of thousands from the region. While the grants from the Arts and Science Council to groups like the Science Museum were basic operating grants, programming for children was a funding criteria. So arts education for children was funded by ASC, the Arts Council, well in excess of the $2.5 million. The proposal was this: if the Arts Council would agree to restrict the usage of all the county dollars to youth programming, then the county commission would not eliminate the Arts and Science Council's $2.5 million from the county. Before I ask you what you would do, let's discuss the ethical dilemma I felt I faced. Earmarking the county dollars for arts education wasn't blatantly an act of censorship. There was no stipulation not to fund the theater company. And while I'm sure the county commissioners assumed no arts group would offer youth content with LGBTQ themes, there was no statement to prevent such programming. Having said so, the citizens of our community knew that the county commissioners' unspoken intent was that. What about right versus right? Was it a greater right to stand against really thinly veiled prejudice and stand for promoting complete freedom of artistic expression, while also rejecting government interference with the Arts Council, as I did the first time around? Were their values tested by the deal but not fully compromised because of the greater need to save the funding? So the question before you is the question I faced. Would you agree to restrict the public funding to arts education, thereby retaining the dollars, or would you reject the deal?
Would that include also science education?
Yes.
So the other funding that you had, was that restricted? Like, would you be able to still maintain the same programs? It's just that the county money wouldn't be.
The county money would be restricted to the arts education programs, which we were funding well in excess of $2.5 million. But county money had to go to that, not to main stage plays or the symphony.
Were there stipulations with the other funding that made it?
No, the other funding is primarily from donors. We're a collective intermediary, right?
Just to clarify that, what the pragmatist in me wants to say is there really a no harm, no foul argument to be made. In other words, how much discretion did you have in that other pile of money where you could direct more to adult programming or programming that
It was completely fungible.
Okay.
So it was a matter of switching the line item.
Sense of whether the county leaders would call this a win if you acquiesced, say that they were able to make you not fund LGBT programming?
Well, I think those that wanted to cut the funding altogether would claim to their constituents that it was a win, right? And certainly those that wanted to keep the funding could see it as a win because we didn't defer to stopping a main stage production, and everybody loves children.
Isn't this essentially the second act of Hamilton?
I actually hadn't thought about that. That's yes, sir.
If, let's say, you spent $3 million for arts and education, you spent that great or something, did you ask them to fund your entire budget for arts education?
So what did I do? How many of you think I took the arts education deal? Raise your hand. And I'm assuming the rest of you said that I didn't. Well, quite to my surprise, I rejected the deal. And I'm going to be completely honest, I probably didn't take it to the board to reject it.
You didn't take it to the board?
I probably didn't take it to the board to make sure it got rejected. Now, you can argue whether that was ethically right or not with boards of directors, but that was my psychological.
So it raises the question, though, about your legal duty and responsibilities as president, reporting to the board, which is in fact has an ultimate responsibility in managing the corporation.
I don't deny it.
What else are you keeping away from the board? How do you feel about job security?
Excuse me?
How do you feel about job security and keeping matters from the board?
Well, I didn't keep matters from the board. The chairman knew. The chairman was part of this.
The board didn't know.
Okay. I'm just telling you the story.
So did you
Okay.
lose the 2.5 some other way?
Excuse me?
Did you lose the 2.5?
I'm going to go to the next. All right. So lo and behold, months later, an LGBTQ student won a playwriting contest from the theater company with an ASD grant recipient with a work that explored her sexual identity. And needless to say, well, I didn't know about that ahead of time. I expect that it all would have erupted again. Well, now it's the evening of the final vote by the Mecklenburg Board of County Commissioners to defund the Arts and Science Council. The public hearing started at 6 p.m. and ended with a vote at 1 a.m. This was the only topic on the agenda. The citizens in attendance flowed out of the chambers into the main lobby. Television viewers throughout the country watched the hearings and deliberations. 50 ministers spoke against, 50 ministers spoke in favor. Corporate Charlotte united behind the Arts Council and spoke at the hearings. Our universities and colleges said they'd never be able to hire academics if we had the reputation of suppressing free speech. One woman sang America the Beautiful in the government chambers. It was a sight to behold. Then at 1 a.m., by a vote of 5 to 4, the Arts and Science Council was defunded. A week later, in the midst of my grappling with how we were going to cut all the grants to our cultural institutions, the phone rings. It's one of our corporate executives from the tall towers in uptown Charlotte. Michael, he said, would you like a few Charlotte corporations to fill the bucket with the full $2.5 million you lost? I was dumbstruck, stunned to learn of such support and generosity, and I placed the same question before each of you. Did I take the money?
Were there any restrictions?
Excuse me? There were no restrictions. Okay, how many of you think I took the money? I declined to take the money. I saw this as a question of right versus right. Authors William Shaw and Vincent Berry write in their book, Narrative Theories of Ethics, when faced with two or more moral obligations in conflict, choose the stronger one. When rival actions will have different results, choose the action that produces the greater good. It was my belief that the very basis of this, of intolerance, prejudice, discrimination, government censorship, and government intervention, had won the Angels in America battle with the defunding of the Arts and Science Council, but I did not believe it had won the war. I hoped that freedom of speech and expression would win, and I hoped that our community would show its tolerance. Without pain and conflict, there is often no resolution and no high calling. I believed the very soul of Charlotte was being tested, but it had not been determined. To accept the corporate philanthropy would have short-circuited the ongoing community dialogue and debate that needed to take place in our city on who we were. I came to believe the greater, stronger good was for our community members to make the ultimate decision, and the lesser good was to accept the generosity. Little did I know how strong the community would respond. And this video tells the story. It's all music and newspaper, so you have to read quickly. sorts of ethical questions, right? Okay, the last case study is current. The case study now involves the second form of philanthropic intermediary we discussed and the one I direct, a community foundation. Earlier, I shared with you that a community foundation is a collection of individual, family, and corporate fund holders representing a microcosm of America with differing social, political, and religious views and values, all living under one big tent. The case study involves donor X. I'm going to use the singular for the purposes of this exercise, but I want to be clear that it's not meant to imply whether I'm discussing one donor or a group of donors. I apologize for being vague, but it's important to the foundation respects the privacy of our fund holders. Donor X makes substantial grants from their fund to support nonprofits that advocate for limited immigration and population control, often through an environmental lens. This means that while they are primarily targeted by the left, they are also sometimes targeted from the right. In addition, some of the nonprofits supported by Donor X through us have been designated as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which, by the way, also receives grants from other fund holders at our community foundation, evidence of our big tent. While the IRS requires us to list all of our grants to nonprofits on our public 990 forms, we are not required, nor do we, list donations of donors to funds we manage. A newspaper article in a national publication ignited the controversy. The reporter identified the foundation as funding source of these controversial nonprofits and suggested the grants might be associated with Donor X. Per our policy, we do not verify any donor information, but we did verify that our 990 form was correct and the grants were awarded from one or more fund holder account, as distinguished from our own discretionary grant pools that are awarded by our board of directors. A handful of organizations based locally and nationally called for us to exercise our tax code authority, referred to for a community foundation as variance power. The tax code allows the board of the community foundation to reject any award that a fund holder makes from his or her fund. That's why you get a higher deductibility than a private foundation, because a community foundation has variance power. Criticism of the foundation generated from the national news articles have been challenging. We were accused of funding and profiting from hate. Protesters invaded our lobby at the foundation. The attacks got very personal with calls for my resignation as a CEO. The list goes on. Here is but one of the attacks we face nationally that's only weeks old. Of note, America's Voice accepts hundreds of thousands of dollars in grant awards from the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. The same year, that foundation granted hundreds of thousands of dollars from donor advised funds to the controversial group in question. Yet there was no attack by America's Voice on the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. For 60 years plus since our inception, Foundation for the Carolinas has had a board policy enabling any 501c3 nonprofit organization designated by the government as educational, charitable, or alien missionary by the IRS and in good standing with the IRS to receive a grant from our fund holders. In other words, no moral judgment layer except the IRS sanction. I'm going to briefly walk you through the review conducted fully by our board in this storm. First, we reviewed the nonprofit grant recipients in question. All promote limited or anti-immigration policies. While not their own generated materials, they make available materials generated by others with racist overtones. 3 of those in question were founded by the late John Tanton, and the New York Times has said of John Tanton that he, quote, over time increasingly made his case against immigration in racial terms. Mr. Tanton, however, was not on any of the boards or staffs at the time the grants were distributed from the fund holder account. Second, our board reviewed our variance power authorities. While the IRS tax code is clear we have such authority, case law from a legal challenge to another community foundation indicates donor intent overrides variance power. There was a case, the San Francisco Community Foundation. So, would Foundation for the Carolinas be subject to legal challenge if exercising variance power if we decided to do so? Particularly in a free speech case when hate speech is protected speech by the Supreme Court. Are philanthropic gifts to nonprofits even an exercise in free speech? And there is a question on whether these nonprofits espouse hate speech to begin with. Certainly political debates on immigration mark the entire history of the United States, though higher pitched in recent times. Third, our board looked for guidance to the IRS and the FBI for direction. Well, the FBI does not track domestic hate groups, only hate crimes. So we got no real direction there. What did the IRS? I quote Marcus Owens, who ran the IRS office that oversees nonprofits. The IRS has to decide within the parameters of free speech whether a group's method of presenting its views are educational. It is fairly difficult for the IRS to deny or revoke tax-exempt status unless there is a call to violence. Fourth, our board reviewed the work of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which designates approximately 1,000 organizations as hate groups on its website. But its credibility has been called into question, with critics calling it a hate group, and they have taken it to court over its designations. Fifth, the board reviewed our past grant making on both the fund holder side of the equation and the discretionary side. Grant making activities of the board itself. We have never funded any of the nonprofits in question. On the contrary, many of our discretionary grants have assisted our local immigrant communities and would clearly be seen as pro-immigration by conservatives. The board concluded we would not use our discretionary dollars to fund such groups. Do we then have double standards? If we wouldn't fund such groups, should we prevent our fund holders from doing so? Sixth, we look to our sister community foundation nationwide for direction. 39 of 62 that were surveyed have policies identical to our policy, naming no additional screen other than the IRS review. Two examples of additional screening we studied, we thought were interesting: Marin County and the New York Community Trust, which is both community foundations. The former asks every nonprofit to sign a non-discrimination document, but SPLC designated hate groups, not seeing themselves as such, could easily sign the form. New York places a moral judgment criteria on all donor fund holder grants to nonprofits, except when it comes to houses of worship, despite the fact that some, for example, discriminate against the LGBTQ community. New York's policies seem to be completely hypocritical to us. Next, we met with a long list of local and pro-immigration groups, mostly serving the Latino community. After much discussion, they accepted differences in policy that distinguish donor fund holders from our discretionary grant awards, which many of them had received. Of course, they would prefer we deny the grants from the fund holder. The NAACP came in, the SPLC flew in from Montgomery and DC to challenge us on this. We explained what we are, all of it. And the SPLC said, well, you're really like the ACLU. You're supporting freedom of speech for fund holders. Well, that was an unexpected twist. And if you go on the ACLU's site, you will find that they say one of their proudest moments is taking Chicago to court, or one of the cities around Chicago, to support a pro-Nazi march. Well, suddenly, the foundation is being aligned to the ACLU, and the Southern Poverty Law Center goes home and is satisfied. We worried that we would be a hate group on the SPLC site. This brought us back to the question of free speech and philanthropy. In other words, the board was not willing to make a decision on the original controversial nonprofits in question. Rather, it wanted to address the bigger policy issue. Our board dealt with this 3 full board meetings. Where would our foundation draw the line? Do we believe philanthropy is a form of free speech? Where does it stop? Do we not deny fund holder grant making to houses of worship that refuse to conduct gay marriages? What about pro-life and pro-choice? Now you're on my governing board, and the question's before you. Do you stop donor X from making the grants to these nonprofit organizations, or do you enable the donor to support any IRS-sanctioned nonprofit? You are now my board.
Carol, you're nodding.
I enable them to support the donor to support if other IRS.
You believe that the donor should...
That the donor should still be able to support them.
Okay.
I work for the ACLU as a long-time consultant.
There you go.
If the IRS has said that they're a legitimate charity and they're in good standing, we grant to them, and we've told donors we don't make value judgments that we grant to the Helms Center at Wingate and to Planned Parenthood, as long as they're legitimate 501c3s.
Okay.
I think the board adopt a signal that they place by each grant that they publish in the annual report. You know, it's either this, that, or that. And you put next to this one, you put the thumbs down.
Oh, so you would make the grant, but make a statement about your view of the grant. Interesting, and not anything that anybody thought of. Leslie?
I think you've muddied the waters on this because it doesn't seem clear to me that these groups, while being anti-immigrants, are actually hate groups.
So what did the board do?
Studied it some more.
I'll tell you, the board reaffirmed its policy to stick with the IRS sanction. Having said so, at last week's board meeting, the question came up, Leslie, what if a donor in their lifetime funded anti-LGBTQ groups, and our policy allows them to do that, if it's a nonprofit that does that, left us an endowment to leave us the discretion to do that? Would we accept that endowment? And the board has not deliberated over it, but my recommendation would be no, we would not. Because then we are in the driver's seat. But that's the next discussion. So we did continue to define the policy as a live donor advised fund holder. And the board does think that there must be some line that a nonprofit crosses. And I go back to my arts days, and it's like, well, when is something pornographic and when is it? You know it when you look at it. I don't know. Leslie, let me tell you something very interesting about a foundation that you used to direct. They wrote us a letter asking us to stop funding, stop enabling the donor to fund through me. My chairman and I went to the board. They have restricted funding to us. We took them through all the fact pattern that I've shared with you, except in slide after slide. It was a very unpleasant meeting, and I don't know that C. Smith Reynolds will ever fund us again.
I'm not sure I agree with that decision either.
No, I'm just telling. What I wanted you to do in both the experience with Angels in America and the experience of this is to feel the heat of being in the position, right? You know how much I respect the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation? To be disrespected by them?
Mary?
The thing that I think is really a shame is that we ought to be able to look to the IRS to, or to some objective entity to tell us who are the hate groups, not another subjective type organization. But if the IRS had the money to do their jobs, they would revoke all these hate groups, but they don't, and it doesn't seem like they're intending to. So, if they were doing their job, we wouldn't have to worry about this conflict.
We tried to find out,
And the IRS is not going to do that. They're going to look at it and say, does it meet the test of the law?
And as our faculty members said, we have seen them revoke in three times. We do not know if they have rejected from the beginning.
Yeah.
That I wouldn't know.
I wish we could go on.
I know, I'm
but
sorry.
No. Thank you. It's absolutely fascinating. I think you were the first speaker to this series who actually involved the audience in the way you did. Absolutely fascinating.
Well, thank you for
Thank
being
you.